Like a silver streak across the midnight sky, our stories move with a brilliance and speed that you will never forget. Experience high-octane drama and the thrill of a narrative that never slows down. Hit subscribe now and catch the streak before it disappears into the dark night.
When a port loses its customs compliance director, cargo doesn't move. Entire supply chains freeze, and a $340 million contract can evaporate before anyone in the boardroom understands what just happened. I was sitting in my truck in the parking garage of the port of Savannah, eating a gas station sandwich and watching container ships move through the channel when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer. That call changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Leonard Briggs. I spent 31 years building something most people in my industry never managed to build. A reputation so solid that federal agents, port authority officers, and customs brokers on 3 continents knew my name before they knew my company's name. I was the customs compliance director at Hargrove Meridian Logistics. We moved cargo. A lot of it. Industrial equipment, pharmaceutical cold chain, automotive parts, defense-adjacent materials that required paperwork so precise that a single wrong digit on a harmonized tariff code could freeze a shipment for 6 weeks. I knew every code, every form, every officer at the port who had the authority to release a hold, and more importantly, I knew the 3 who would place one if they smelled something off. I had relationships built over 3 decades, not because I was charming, but because I was honest and I was right. Every single time. My office was small. I didn't care about the office. I cared about my files. I kept records the way my father kept his woodworking tools, organized, labeled, maintained. Every broker license renewal, every CBP ruling request we'd ever submitted, every prior disclosure I'd filed on behalf of clients going back to 1997. I had binders. I had digital backups. I had a secondary digital backup stored off-site at a server facility in Atlanta. My administrative assistant, a woman named Vera, who'd worked with me for 11 years, used to joke that if the building burned down, my filing system would survive purely out of stubbornness. I also held the only active customs broker license in the entire company. That detail matters. I'll come back to it. Hargrove Meridian went through a leadership transition in the spring. Our founder, Patrick Hargrove, retired at 72 after a minor cardiac event that his doctor described as a warning shot. Patrick was old school. He believed in expertise. He believed in institutional memory. He used to walk the floor of our operations center and stop at my office just to talk. Not about work specifically, but about how things connected. He understood that a company like ours ran on relationships and paper trails, and that both took decades to build. His son took over in April. I'll call him my new CEO, because that's what he was, and because I'm not interested in using his name as a punchline. He was 38 years old. He had an MBA from a school I won't name, a consulting background, and the particular confidence of a man who had never once been wrong in a way that cost him personally. He brought in a new VP of operations, someone from outside the logistics industry entirely, a man who'd spent his career optimizing retail fulfillment centers. Faster throughput, reduced headcount, eliminate redundancy. Those were the words I heard in my first meeting with him. He said redundancy the way some people say mold, like it was something to be eliminated before it spread. He looked at my department and saw 4 people doing work that modern software could handle. He was not entirely wrong that software had improved. He was catastrophically wrong about what software couldn't do. I tried to explain. I put together a 12-page memo. I still have it, that outlined exactly what my department managed: the active customs broker license, the ACE portal credentials, the ACP, the 2 prior disclosure agreements that required annual compliance certifications, the export control filings under EA/OR for 3 of our largest clients, the ISF filings for every ocean import shipment, and the relationship management with the 3 customs brokers we used for overflow. Software could assist with some of that. Software could not hold a license. Software could not pick up the phone when an officer at Port of Charleston had a question about a shipment manifest at 9:30 on a Friday night. My new VP of operations read my memo. I know he read it because he referenced page 7 in his response email, where he told me that my concerns were noted and that the company was moving in a new direction. My annual salary was $127,000. My department's total cost, including Vera and 2 junior analysts, was approximately $310,000 per year. He told my new CEO they could replace all of us with a $40,000 per year software subscription and a part-time contractor. My new CEO approved it on a Tuesday. I found out on Thursday. I was called into HR that Thursday afternoon. The woman from HR was professional and clearly uncomfortable. She handed me a separation agreement and told me my last official day would be in 2 weeks. I asked if there was a transition plan. She said the VP of operations was handling the knowledge transfer. I nodded and asked if I could have a few minutes alone. I sat in that conference room for a long time. I thought about the ISF filings due on 3 client shipments the following month. I thought about the annual compliance certification for the prior disclosure agreement that was due in 60 days. I thought about the fact that my customs broker license, the one that made it legal for Hargrove Meridian to transact as an importer of record, was issued to me personally, not to the company. To Leonard Briggs, licensed customs broker, license number 29XXXX, issued by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. A company can have employees who hold customs broker licenses, but the license belongs to the individual. If I left, the company needed someone else with an active license to step in, where they needed to operate under a third-party broker for every single shipment, which was expensive, slower, and required new power of attorney authorizations from every client. I didn't say any of this in the conference room. I signed the acknowledgement that I'd received the separation paperwork, and I went back to my office. I finished my 2 weeks. I trained no one, because no one showed up for training. The VP of operations told Vera, in an email I later saw, that the new system would handle onboarding automatically. Vera forwarded me that email without comment. She was a professional. She was also, I could tell, quietly furious. On my last day, I boxed up my personal items. I left the files. I left the binders. I left everything that belonged to the company in good order, labeled, organized, exactly as I'd maintained it for 31 years. I did not take anything that wasn't mine. I did not sabotage anything. I did not send a company-wide email. I updated my license status with CBP to reflect that I was no longer affiliated with Hargrove Meridian Logistics. That's it. That's all I did. I went home. My wife had made pot roast, which is my favorite, because she knew it had been a hard week. My son called from college that evening. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine, which was mostly true, and that his mother's pot roast was better than anything I'd eaten in the last 10 years, which was completely true. I wasn't angry. I was tired in the way you get tired after carrying something heavy for a long time and finally setting it down. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I was 57 years old and I had a reputation and a license and 31 years of experience, and, as of that Friday, no employer. I started calling people I knew. 6 weeks after my last day at Hargrove Meridian, I got a call from a freight forwarder I'd worked with for 15 years. He told me, carefully, that he'd heard some things. That Hargrove Meridian had missed an ISF filing on a major ocean import. That CBP had issued a warning. That the VP of operations had apparently called 3 different freight brokers trying to find someone who could retroactively fix a prior disclosure violation, and that no one had been willing to touch it. I thanked him for letting me know. I didn't call anyone at Hargrove Meridian. 2 weeks after that, I got a call from a former colleague who worked at a trade compliance consulting firm. She told me that Hargrove Meridian's name had come up in a conversation with CBP's regulatory audit division, not in a good way. I still didn't call anyone at Hargrove Meridian. What was happening, without me there to prevent it, was predictable to anyone who understood the system. The software subscription handled routine filings adequately. What it couldn't handle were the exceptions. And in customs compliance, exceptions are constant. A vessel changes port of arrival. A manufacturer updates a component and the tariff classification shifts. A client's shipment gets flagged for examination and someone needs to respond to the CF-28 request for information within 5 business days, or the goods get held indefinitely. The part-time contractor they'd hired, I later learned he had a customs broker license, which solved that particular legal problem, was handling 8 other clients simultaneously, and had no knowledge of Hargrove Meridian's specific client history, their ongoing rulings, or the prior disclosure agreements that required active management. He was doing his best. It wasn't enough. The real problem came in month 4. Hargrove Meridian had been in advanced negotiations with a German industrial consortium. I'll call them the client because they're not the story, for a logistics services contract worth approximately $340 million over 5 years. This was the largest contract in the company's history. My new CEO had been working on it for 18 months. It was going to define his tenure. The consortium's compliance team flew in from Hamburg for the final due diligence review. They were serious, thorough people who understood regulatory risk, because Germany takes regulatory risk seriously in a way that American corporate culture sometimes doesn't. Their lead auditor, a precise, soft-spoken man who I've since met and genuinely respect, spent 3 days reviewing Hargrove Meridian's compliance infrastructure. He reviewed the ACE portal transaction history. He reviewed the prior disclosure file. He reviewed the current power of attorney documentation for client accounts. He reviewed the customs broker license on file for the company. On the third day, in the boardroom with my new CEO and his VP of operations and their legal team all present, the auditor opened his folder and placed a document on the table. It was the CBP broker license verification report. He asked, very calmly, who their current licensed customs broker was. The VP of operations named the part-time contractor. The auditor nodded, checked something in his folder, and then pointed out that the power of attorney documentation for 4 of Hargrove Meridian's largest accounts, the accounts the consortium most cared about, still listed my name, Leonard Briggs, a man who was no longer employed by or affiliated with the company. He asked how long this discrepancy had existed. No one in the room knew the answer, because no one in the room had been managing it. He then asked about the 2 prior disclosure agreements. He had obtained copies. I don't know how, but regulatory documents have a way of surfacing, and the most recent annual compliance certification for one of them listed my name as the responsible officer, dated 3 months after my termination. Someone had apparently auto-generated the certification using the old template, with my name on it, submitted to CBP, under my credentials. The auditor set his pen down. He said that his firm could not recommend proceeding with a logistics partner that had active compliance documentation filed under the name of a former employee, that had outstanding power of attorney irregularities across major accounts, and that had, based on his review of the ACE transaction history, a pattern of late and corrected ISF filings over the preceding 4 months that suggested systemic compliance infrastructure failure. He said this quietly, without drama. Then he closed his folder. My new CEO looked at his VP of operations. His VP of operations had no expression on his face that anyone could describe as useful. The consortium's team flew back to Hamburg the following morning. Their legal counsel sent a formal withdrawal from negotiations 2 weeks later. $340 million. That's when my phone rang. The number I didn't recognize. It was my new CEO. He didn't identify himself at first, just asked if I was Leonard Briggs. When I said yes, he said he was calling personally, not through HR or legal. He said he wanted to discuss a consulting arrangement. I was sitting in my truck eating a gas station sandwich. I finished the sandwich before I responded. I asked what he needed. He told me in broad terms about the situation, the withdrawal, the CBP issues, the documentation problems. He didn't mention the German consortium by name, but I knew. My network had been keeping me informed. I told him I would need to think about it. I asked him to have his legal team send me a formal consulting proposal. I told him my rate was $350 per hour and that I would require a retainer and that any engagement would be contingent on my review of the current compliance situation, which might take time to fully assess given that I'd been gone for 4 months. He agreed immediately. That told me everything I needed to know about how bad things were. My attorney reviewed the consulting agreement. It took 10 days to finalize. In that time, I talked to Vera, who had stayed on in a reduced capacity and was quietly appalled by what she'd witnessed. She told me about the auto-generated certification. She told me about the missed filings. She told me about the VP of operations who had apparently spent 2 weeks telling people that the CBP issues were a systems problem and would be resolved algorithmically. Vera said this last part with a tone I will not attempt to reproduce in writing. I went back in on a Monday morning, not to my old office. They'd converted it to a hot desking space, which I found faintly amusing. I sat up at a conference table with my laptop and my notes, and I started the assessment. The first thing I did was file emergency notices with CBP to clarify the power of attorney situation. That required signed authorizations from each client. I spent 3 days on the phone explaining the situation, being honest about what had happened, and asking for their patience. Most of them gave it. One of them terminated their contract with Hargrove Meridian on the spot. which I had expected and told my new CEO to anticipate. The second thing I did was address the prior disclosure certification issue. That was the most serious legal exposure. Filing a CBP compliance document under the name of a former employee without that employee's knowledge or authorization was not a minor administrative error. I brought in an outside customs attorney, not Hargrove Meridian's in-house counsel, to navigate the voluntary correction process. The goal was to get ahead of it before CBP's regulatory audit division made it something larger. It cost the company significantly. I won't speculate on the exact figure, but the combination of penalties, legal fees, corrective filings, and the expedited broker authorization fees to bring accounts into proper documentation was not a small number. The third thing I did was train the part-time contractor properly. He was actually quite capable once he understood the specific requirements of the Hargrove Meridian accounts. He'd been set up to fail by being handed a caseload with no context. We spent 3 weeks going through everything, client by client, filing by filing, ruling by ruling. By the end of it, he had what he needed to manage the portfolio adequately. Whether adequately was enough for a company that had been trying to land a $340 million contract was a different question. My VP of Operations resigned in month 2 of my engagement. I heard through Vera that he had framed it as a mutual decision. I have no strong feelings about that framing. The German consortium, I found this out later through a contact, had not entirely closed the door. Their withdrawal had been a consequence of the specific compliance failures uncovered in due diligence, not a reflection of their broader interest in the American logistics market. Hargrove Meridian, once the remediation was documented and verifiable, theoretically had a path back to the table. My new CEO asked me, about 6 weeks into my engagement, whether I would consider coming back full-time. I told him I appreciated the offer. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think about it for very long. I was 57 years old with a spotless license, a rebuilt professional network, and a consulting rate that was generating more income than my old salary. I had been reminded in a way that required no argument that my expertise was not overhead. It was the thing the business ran on. I told him I would continue as a consultant through the end of the remediation period and that I would help him hire and onboard a full-time compliance director, someone younger, someone who could build the department back properly, someone I would train and vouch for. That was what I offered. He accepted. I found him a good candidate, a woman in her early 40s who had spent 12 years at a major freight forwarder and understood both the regulatory framework and the relationship side of the work. I spent 8 weeks with her, going through everything. By the time I stepped back, she had what I'd had: the files, the context, the relationships, and a clear picture of what the job actually required. The German consortium eventually came back. The final contract was smaller than the original. The withdrawal had given their procurement team leverage to renegotiate terms, but it closed. I know because my new CEO sent me a text message the day it happened, just the dollar amount and a handshake emoji. I didn't respond immediately. I was having dinner with my wife and my son, who was home for a long weekend. My wife had made pot roast again. My son was telling a long story about something that had happened at school that I'm fairly sure I didn't entirely follow, but that made everyone at the table laugh. I looked at the text message later, after dinner, standing at the kitchen sink. I thought about 31 years of filings and phone calls and late Friday nights at the port. I thought about the 12-page memo nobody read. I thought about the gas station sandwich. I typed back, "Congratulations." Then I went back to the table and finished my coffee. I tell this story because it's not really about me. Or, it's not only about me. Every industry has people like me. People who know which form to file when the automated system throws an error at 11 p.m. People who know that the officer working Gate 7 on Tuesdays has a particular way of reading manifests, and that if you present documentation in a certain order, he moves faster. People who remember that one client's tariff classification got changed after a CBP ruling in 2019, and that if you don't flag that history when the goods come in, you'll get hit with a retroactive duty assessment that takes 8 months to resolve. That knowledge doesn't live in software. It doesn't transfer in a 2-week handoff. It accumulates over decades, and it's quiet. You only notice it when it's gone. I've talked to a lot of people over the past few years who've been through versions of the same thing. A manufacturing plant manager in Ohio who got replaced by a process optimization consultant who had never seen a factory floor. A hospital billing director in Tennessee who was let go after 28 years then watched as the new system generated $2.3 million in Medicare coding errors in 11 months. A municipal engineer in a mid-sized city who'd maintained the stormwater infrastructure records for 30 years retired and came back 18 months later on a contract because the city couldn't locate the documentation for a drainage system that was failing. We don't talk about ourselves much. We don't usually have dramatic stories with boardroom confrontations and international auditors and nine-figure contracts. Most of the time, it's quieter than that. A fine here, a delay there, a client relationship that frays and eventually snaps. But sometimes it's loud. And when it's loud, people call. I keep my license current. I update my continuing education every year. I answer my phone. The man who knows where the filing is, the original, signed, properly authenticated version from 2008 that CBP wants to see, will always have work. That's not a threat. It's just how things are. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a mystical way. I don't believe the universe was keeping score on my behalf. I believe something simpler and, in some ways, harder to accept, that most consequences are just math. You remove something load-bearing from a structure, the structure eventually shows you what it needed. It doesn't matter whether you meant well. It doesn't matter whether you had a good quarter right after. The weight was always there. My new CEO's son, the man who stood in a conference room and announced he'd saved the company $310,000, wasn't a villain in any dramatic sense. He was a man who looked at a spreadsheet and saw a number he could reduce. He saw my salary, Vera's salary, 2 junior analysts, and a software subscription that cost a fraction of all of it. On paper, the math worked. The problem is that compliance doesn't live on paper. It lives in the spaces between the filings, in the judgment calls made at 11 p.m. when a shipment gets flagged, in 31 years of knowing exactly which question to ask the officer at which port on which day. He couldn't see that because he'd never had to. And that's not entirely his fault, but the decision was still his. What I've come to understand is that integrity in a career, the real kind, not the kind you put on a resume, is built through decades of invisible choices. Every filing I submitted accurately when a shortcut was available. Every time I told a client the truth about a compliance issue instead of papering over it. Every Friday night I stayed at my desk because a shipment needed someone who actually understood what was at stake. None of those moments felt significant in the moment. They were just the job, but they accumulated into something that couldn't be replicated by a software subscription and a part-time contractor who'd never heard of our client histories. That's what I want people to take from this. Not the boardroom moment, not the German auditor, not the $340 million figure. Those are just the visible part. The real story is the 31 years before any of that happened. Vera understood it. Patrick Hargrove understood it. The auditor from Hamburg understood it the moment he looked at the documentation trail. The people who do careful, unglamorous, essential work always recognize each other. And the people who don't do that work often don't realize what it is until it's absent. I'm not bitter about what happened. I genuinely am not. I came out of it with a consulting practice, a rate that reflects my actual value, and the clearest possible confirmation that the work I'd spent my life doing was real and necessary. My son called the week I finalized the consulting agreement and asked how I was. I told him I was good. Better than I'd expected to be. He said that sounded like me. I didn't know exactly what he meant by that, but I took it as a compliment. What I'd tell anyone in a similar position, whether you're the Leonard in the story or the person managing a Leonard, is this: expertise that took decades to build cannot be evaluated on a quarterly cost reduction spreadsheet. The cost of losing it doesn't show up immediately. It shows up when the auditor opens his folder. Build something worth keeping. Then keep it carefully. That's the whole job, in any field, at any level. Everything else is just the story you tell afterward.